Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at here, the workshop on medical and healthcare data law and society. My name is Fumiko Kudo from the University of Tokyo, and I am the MC of the event. To kick off the workshop, we are pleased to have Professor Jiro Kokuryo, the Vice President of Keio University and the Chief Administrator of Keio University Cyber Civilization Research Center, to start the opening remarks. Professor Kokuryo, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for spending your busy time of your schedule to attend what we think is a very, very important topic, which is on how to deal, how social and legal institution has to be designed to meet the needs of this data society, particularly in the area of medicine and healthcare. And I would like to extend my particular appreciation for, I'm very sorry, I don't know the English name for People Kyoso Katsuyo Consortium. Okay. Who is a partner in organizing this. And I am also grateful to Japan Medical Venture Association, who is in support of this conference. And today we have the pleasure of having Mr. Sawaki, who is a counselor in the excuse me again. I need to check the Japanese. Oops, thank you very much. Personal Information Protection Commission of Japan to participate in this program. In the interest of time, I would like to sort of jump into, because I'm the coordinator of the next section, on some of the issues that need to be discussed, and I think at the very root, what we want to think about is how to maximize the collective value of information. Now we are living in the age of powerful computers and powerful sensor networks that's capable of collecting large amounts of data and generating a lot of value from these data. At the same time, we would like to honor whatever and however that means, the data ownership and control by the individuals. So how do we simultaneously maximize the data, the value of data, while honoring the individual rights, is probably at the root of this. Now, we would like to think about more contemporary topics, such as, of course, in the previous G20 meeting, it was the Japanese government who promoted the concept of data free flow with trust, whatever that means. And we have experts who are actually responsible for coming this terminology with us today, so we can ask questions about these things. And more importantly, once we know what that means, we have to start thinking about how that can be substantiated technically and institutionally. And similarly, I think one of the big topics that we are trying to think through is whether or not this trust can be accomplished by regulating platforms. And whether that is the right strategy to take, and if that is the right strategy to take, what are the actual regulations we should introduce to platforms that in order to accomplish that. Now, in all of these contexts, today I think that the focus, because Professor Miyata is one of the is probably the person who initiated this conference, the health and the medical data. Of course, they are highly sensitive data, and yet that is an area where collective use of data can potentially bring huge benefits to people. So in what way should health and medical data be treated differently, and on a common philosophical basis? And again, I like to think about what technical and institutional requirements or technologies are available to make these things happen. So I think in the discussion just after this, I think I'd like to ask Professor David Farber to share your thoughts around that, and perhaps share some of the international situation with, of course, Europe and US has very different both philosophical and legal framework. And I know you're not a law professional, but perhaps your views on things like GDPR and some of the European approaches to this, and if you can contrast that to the U.S. situations, so that which will give us hint on. And I understand you are also been following what's being discussed in some of the trade talks like TPP, which unfortunately the U.S. is not part of. But so if we can have that kind of international context in mind, I think that will help the discussion that follows. So I'm sorry, I already started the part two. Oh no, this is part one of the discussions. But I hope I am pretty sure that the people in the audience has a lot of expertise. So I'm very much looking forward for fruitful discussion today. So thank you very much again for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Kokuryo. Now we are honored to invite the grandfather of the Internet, Professor David Farber, the co-director of Keio University Cyber Civilization Research Center, to give us a keynote speech on the global trends in personal data. Professor Farber is known as a critical player in the development of the Internet information age as we know it today. He joined Keio University last year to continue his research aspiration on technology advancement and the impact to the human civilization. Let's welcome Professor Farber.
Thank you. Jiro asked me to sort of, rather than give an address, to focus on the two items that he talked about in his introduction, and I pleasure to do that. Let me first emphasize that I am not a lawyer. I've been involved through my activities at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and an EPIC in the United States for many years on privacy protection and the attempts of some laws to violate it and to protect it. So I'll come at it from that perspective of that. Medical information is very, very sensitive, as I'm sure all of you appreciate. It's sensitive for the person, it's sensitive for their jobs, it's sensitive for their life, basically. And so the protection of that information is extremely personally valuable and important. On the other hand, having that information available, it can both help governments and individuals and municipalities in protecting the health of their population. For instance, as I go around different places in the United States for getting different medical treatment, I keep having to fill out the same forms, forgetting things that I've gotten or forgetting vaccinations I've had. And so there's a very inconsistent view of my health, of my records. As I go across countries, it even gets worse. And certainly the free availability of unified health records would be extremely valuable for the individual, as well as the health records and health control, finding epidemics, finding reactions to drug treatments, etc. 15 years ago, our National Science Foundation held a meeting of people interested in unified health records in the United States. And a whole set of problems were surfaced. 5 years ago, they held a similar meeting, and the same set of concerns and problems were discussed yet again. There's been very little progress in the U.S. for getting any consistency, and part of that is the independence of hospital systems, the heavily computerization, and therefore freezing into, I'll use the term concrete, making it rigid because it's very hard to change programs. Also, a lot of pressure from both the public sector and the private sector, sometimes pulling in opposite directions. But I think everybody agrees that it would be incredibly valuable if we could get a standard. Even within a state in the United States, we have different problems. So what's the problem of doing that, more or less internationally? I should comment that the Europeans and the Americans have a fundamentally different view on privacy from a governmental level. It's very complicated, and the Europeans are very complicated because they represent a large number of different views attempting to bring together. We were hoping, at least part of the US was hoping, that the European standards could be transferable to the US, or at least give hints. We've had some real problems with the details of that. And again, it's a new attempt on the part of nation states, particularly the EU, to come up with a standard way of treating personal data in general, which they address. Let me address for a moment the health data, which is very sensitive. We've had, and I'm sure many nations have had, dramatic failures of the data systems in protecting data. And we've lost, through our credit rating organizations, lost an incredible amount of information about people because of the lack of adequate technical protection. Sometimes the lack of administrative control. Many of our critical data in the private sector were stored unencrypted, so even rudimentary protection wasn't there. Last week, I think it was, there was a report, this week perhaps, there was a report of a huge volume of medical, let me call it, x-rays and things like that, medical images, having been stored without any real protection. And anything you store without any real protection is going to be vulnerable. And it was leaked as big surprise, it was ripped off, and now there's a huge amount of data out there about individuals. Notice that in the United States, and I'm not a lawyer, one of the places that this is very damaging is in employment. The way the US medical system is set up, companies are prone not to like to hire people who might have a lot of medical problems. And so access to both existing medical records and DNA information is used to, in hiring decisions. Why hire a person that's going to raise your premiums, corporate premiums? And so that information is can be widely misused. So I think, on one hand, I love the idea of being able to have that information available. I have very little trust in regulation per se being adequate unless the regulation also has within it technical requirements for protection. Regulations in and of itself has shown in the United States to be not very valuable, not very enforceable. If they specify technical requirements that can be evaluated, then they can be. And we know in principle how to protect medical data much better than we have now. And it's not just protecting the whole ensemble of data, but it's protecting the individual's rights to privacy of their particular data. This arises, I'll use an analogy because we haven't had to face this in the medical area. Many years ago, there was an attempt in the United States to, it was called Clipper Chip, marvelous thing. And the notion was that everybody would like to encrypt their data, but governments would like to be able to access that data under certain conditions. Okay? And so the notion was the government would have a super key that they could go in under hopefully judicial control and access that data. The problem that all of us faced with that is that's fine as long as A, you have judicial overrides, and B, that you never lose that key. Because if you lose that key, everything is available. And so it was fought down, keeps popping up every 5 years, but it was fought down on the ground that if the key was ever lost, you had dramatic problems. So as we start dealing with medical data, we not only have protection of the data within a national environment, but we have the need for protection of data as it goes across those environments. Because in fact, the internet almost guarantees that it will. I think it's an interesting technical problem. I think it's an extremely critical problem. And I look forward to helping if I can.
Thank you, Professor Farber. And it really gave us some new thoughts, a new insight towards the use of personal data. Now, to continue the discussion, we are happy to invite Professor Miyata, Professor of Health Policy and Management School of Medicine at Keio University, who is also a member of the Cyber Civilization Research Center, to have a dialogue with Professor Farber to discuss the global drift of data management and the position of Japan. Professor Kokuryo will be the moderator of the dialogue. I will now pass the control to Professor Kokuryo. Please, Professor Kokuryo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Miyata, let me ask just one question to Dave, and then ask you to comment on these. Dave, in your speech, you said there is a very great difference between Europe and US in thinking about privacy. Can you elaborate just a little bit on what the key differences is? And of course, and if you have any thoughts about how it should be reflected in Japan or in the rest of the world, I'll be yeah.
Now, again, I'm speaking as an individual looking at the issue, not as a lawyer, okay, which I'm not. I can almost argue constitutional law, but just the United States. I think the Europeans are much more sensitive to personal data than the United States. That has a long track record. Some of it goes back to World War II, when in fact the data that was gathered in some countries was used by the opponents to do some rather nasty things. And so there's a tendency to say, my data is my data. You know, I don't want anybody to access it without a lot of permission. And you can see it in GDPR. In the United States, it's quite different. I think if you ask the average American, they'd sort of say, yeah, I would prefer not to have the fact that I have this known to my neighbors, but it's not all that important. And they're much more willing to let corporate entities decide that. Now, there are some limits, but they're rather spiky. For argument's sake, we ran into a problem with our pharmacies who, while their pharmacy data is strictly confidential, although it's been compromised endlessly because their protection of their computer systems aren't very good. Non-prescription material is not controlled at all, and so people were getting coupons for diapers and things like that because the medication they were using, non-prescription medication, was the type of things that a pregnant woman would buy. And so the companies were doing massive looking at data and decided this person was obviously pregnant, or they wouldn't have gotten things for morning sickness and sent them, which caused incredible problems and annoyances. But, you know, again, it's the US just doesn't have that sensitivity for it. Japan, I'm not an expert in Japan, obviously. I've only been here for a year now. But I think there's a lot more trust in government in Japan than there is in certainly the US and probably Europe. And so the fact that your Constitution guarantees privacy sort of gives people a warm, fuzzy feeling. On the other hand, I get the feeling, and again, permit me to be blunt about it, I get the feeling that there's a lot more surveillance potential in Japan than there is in the US. And so I think we're sitting at a very interesting thing as long as things are peaceful and calm. You know, probably Japan is in good shape. If things get a little bit off for some reason, there's just a huge amount of surveillance and data available. Is that good or is that bad? From an American standpoint, I think it's bad. From a Japanese standpoint, I'm not sure.
Great, thank you very much. Can I call you Hiroaki?
So when I have a discussion with Dave, so he says EU GDPR is half brilliant and half nightmare, and I totally agree with you. So as for the GDPR, the data portability or the right to access, I think it will become a fundamental human rights in 21st century. But on the other hand, their way to manage the data is a nightmare. So they just think their data like the exclusive good. So when we think about oil or such kind of clubs, so it's when we use that, it disappears. So such kind of exclusive usage rule is essential. But when we think about the data, so one patient up to the million patient, so one patient can receive the more superior quality of their healthcare, and the 1 million, 10 million, and 1,000 million, so it will become powerful. So this is a shared good. So I think it's, you already say the GDPR is fundamental human rights, but we should think how can we share the data. And also you mentioned about the United States, it's an industry-driven model. So already Amazon and also the Google and Facebook capture the data. But such kind of industry-driven model is a winner takes all. So it's tend to become the data hegemony by the big giants. So I think it's a potential risk for the world. So Japan side, we like to step forward in different way. Maybe if we have a third way or the alternative, we'd like to better to cultivate how can we share the data.
Little comment. The big part of the data problem in many cases is not the fact that people can access the data, but the attribution of who accessed it. For instance, if I go back to my chipper clip, okay, the issue there was the proposal had warrants being required in order to get at the keys for a particular person's data. But warrants without attribution is a potential for incredible compromise. In the United States, judges, and I gather in Japan, judges are also rather flexible in giving warrants. The notion that we've tried to propose when we were looking at that, didn't get very far, was that in fact the issuing of warrants itself, the issuing of access, should be controlled by the same computer system. So in fact, if you issue a warrant, it should be inscribed in irreversible data that warrant was issued, to who was it issued, for what was it issued, and by who it was issued.
And is that technically possible?
Yes, it's technically possible. Now, with our current data systems, it's tricky as heck, but we do know how to build things which are considerably better than we have now. And that technology has been around for years. It's a little on the expensive side to start with, but the nice thing about computers is they get faster, and so once you put it in, 2 years and all the overhead is gone because the computers are getting faster.
Hiroaki, is the notion of limited access shared data probably means in a medical context, not to the general public, but within the medical community. Is that acceptable?
Oh, is it about the silo effect?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what Dave is saying is that technically it should be possible to
exactly.
provide sufficient access control to particular people. So I mean, sharing of privacy data to general public is probably is problematic, but sharing of data among people who are given right to should be technically possible.
Yeah, exactly. So in Japan, we started to discuss about how can we share the data with general publics. But the all data of public is it is very difficult. It's have a privacy matter, and also there sometimes disturb the appropriate healthcare. So we just start from the health check data, like a laboratory, HbA1c, or the creatinine, or such kind of the objective data. So we already give back to the patient and general public. So that's already possible. So after that, we like to expand the lightweight of the data, such kind of the prescription, and so we our plan is gradually expand how can we share the data. So there just a region like starting from the health check and the next to the press collection and the imaging data, and so this is step by step.
Now, assuming, I mean, I think we are starting to talk about some kind of managed sharing of data. And then the next question is who manages it? And Hiroaki was raising this skepticism towards the industry doing it. And then I think the discussion around platform regulation is also very diverse between Europe and US, but nevertheless, there's a lot of discussion going on. Well, Hiroaki seemed to be going to one extreme of not allowing industry to do this at all. But of course, Americans would like to see it more on private sector initiative with some kind of regulations. If that's the case, what sort of regulation is meaningful socially and technically implementable is I mean, do you have comment on all these things?
Hours, but that's another story. I think that some of this is attitude. I would emphasize in the United States that certainly for the last 2 or 3 generations, the term trust government has no meaning. We just don't, right? Now, whether that's good or bad is another philosophical thing. But I think we're beginning also not to trust industry. And so the set of regulations, it seems to me, should control both. Now, government has some override rights in the sense that it has obligations that industry maybe shouldn't have or maybe doesn't have. But that shouldn't relax the demands that it conform to the privacy rules. So I think you want that across the board. Now, that gets into a lot of problems, as you know, especially in the United States where, for instance, the Congress quietly wires itself out of all regulations for everything. But again, if you're dealing with sensitive data like this and you want to be able to use it correctly, you're going to have a set of rules that doesn't depend on who's touching it. I mean, if government is touching it and passes on to industry fractions, the same rules should apply, and vice versa. And again, technically, I think we understand how to do that. I'm not saying it's easy, but I understand how to do it. What I don't understand is how to transition from the mess we're in now, at least I'm talking about the United States, to what it should be. And just to add insult to injury, if you want, we've seen a almost uncontrolled spread of DNA data in the United States, which is extremely dangerous data. And there's almost no controls on it in practice. And when it's not too late, but it's getting to be too late. And so I would love to see government take a role in forcing conformity, but having it subject to the same rules, same regulations. And those regulations should have teeth in it, namely technical teeth. Otherwise, countries are not going to trust each other. I'm not going to trust my data going to Canada even, right? Unless I know the Canadian law is compatible with my law. Otherwise, it'll go up, change, and come right back down again.
Totally agree with Dave's opinion. So the both, just industry and also the government collaboration is essential to share the trustful data platform. And so with Japan, we would like to establish the person-centered and open platform. This is so how can we build a trust? This is for each people, each patient and each citizen. We can explain the value of data. So that's the person-centered. Not only about the information API access, but also for the value. And so this is our the principle. And on the other hand, we also propose the authorized public purpose access. This is called APPA. So when we only think about the person-centered platform, it takes more time. And sometimes when we think about a smart city, this IoT sensoring data is very hard to share the person center. So such kind of the authorized usage is also required, I think. Maybe the Dr. Fujita give us the sexy explanation.
Okay. Look forward to that. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Comment on that. A large part of the sensitivity towards medical data being available is the inability to anonymize it. We've shown in endless times that the techniques used for anonymization don't work, and there's reason to believe that the advances in, I'll use the term badly, AI, makes it harder and harder to anonymize data, because now you can search for a lot more key entities. And so the ability to anonymize that data so that anybody could look at the gross behavior of it, but not be able to identify who it is, I think is going to be very, very important, certainly in places where you worry about misuse of that data. And remember, when you're dealing with DNA especially, people are claiming that by looking at the DNA, they can forecast potential criminals. Now, that's very dangerous, considering there's big debate on whether you actually can. But again, we're dealing with extremely sensitive stuff. So it strikes me that, in fact, there's an opportunity in Japan to actually come up with a system that protects the data, makes it widely available, makes it available for government in case, but protects it and protects the anonymity of that data. And then using that to spread to the rest of the world, that good techniques.
Thank you. So you also say that DNA is dangerous. I agree with you. So about the DNA, it's a snapshot agreement is not enough. So when we utilize the DNA, we can kill the people with such kind of the allergy within the in-flight meals, delivery. So it's a perfect climb. So we need such kind of dynamic consent for the DNA. So we should keep the relationship with the people. That's also the reason why we require person-centered approach. Yeah.
But are you not contradicting yourself? I mean, on one hand, you are saying the power of profiling makes anonymity almost an obsolete notion. And on the other hand, you want to share and control.
Yeah, I always reserve the right to contradict myself. But I think there are two different issues. One is if in fact the people who look at the data and have enough purview of the data are heavily controlled, i.e. government, with controls on what government does, that's one issue. And yes, there you probably in fact want to break the anonymization. Because if you have somebody with a particular problem, you want to be able to control that. Right? On the other hand, the public access to that data should be tightly controlled because you cannot guarantee the anonymization, and there's no way you can control the public as a whole. Maybe you can control government. It's contradictory, but it's pragmatic if you want.
Oh, sorry. So in Japan, we already confront with a serious profiling problem, like a recruit matters. Yes. So, yeah, it's a freshman recruitment delivered to the other company. Maybe the Dr. Oya or the Dr. Yamamoto mentioned about that. That's a good text to step forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Hiroaki, you were relatively in your previous comment, relatively explicitly anti-industry. Anti-industry, the distrust, industry cannot be trusted? No. Okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I also collaborate with the many industry, but industry alone sometimes fell into the pitfall. So maybe if we like to give the revenue, take the revenue, just exclusive usage on the just kick off the other player as the short-term objective. But if we can share the data, the industry can step forward. It's I think such kind of the building public trust is the shortest way to expand their own business, I think. So we already have a discussion about how can we share the trust through such kind of data solution with many industries.
So what would it take in your opinion, what would it take for industry to be trusted?
Yes, so the first step of the data-driven society is just to capture the data and utilize for the profit. But now the world is changing, so the SDG is coming and also the GDPR coming. So we have to show the accountability. And so we already collaborate with Pokemon company and also Niantic. So their main principle is utilize data for well-being. So the first for well-being, the second or third thing is profit. So that's their principle, and we deeply respect their project. So we collaborate together. So such kind of the data for well-being or data for the public goods is there, and also the Apple and Google and Amazon is changing. So the Google is AI for public goods, and also the Apple say it's healthcare is the next biggest issue for Apple.
Probably the best way to control industry is to do what was done in the U.S. with Sarbanes-Oxley, and that's to make the senior management of the company responsible and liable for misbehavior. In the U.S., if you, at least in principle, if your security of your company is bad and gets compromised, it's the senior management who can be sued and punished legally and otherwise. Now, how that's enforced is another story, but at least in principle, it's there. And I think if you look at what's happened in the U.S. for massive compromises, essentially nothing. You know, the credit company, reporting company, which did a massive thing. Yeah, there's been some lawsuits, but they're very hard to prosecute. So there's no responsibility, corporate responsibility on the top. And that's one way that's been shown to be very effective. Very senior management tends to pay attention to places where if something happens, they're liable.
I see there a slight difference. Meaning that when you say about responsibility, are you talking about criminal responsibility or commercial or the civil responsibility? And I'm asking this question because there seems to be a huge difference between the U.S. and Europe around
this. Yes. I'm talking in the U.S. context, both civil liability and criminal liability. And certainly, there haven't been that many prosecutions, but certainly we have a track record of, in some of the companies that kept their books a little bit loose, that senior management has been held criminally liable. But certainly, and again, this is I'm not a lawyer, but this seems to be ongoing legal process, and it's going to be different in every country. But if we're to tie together the world, there are a whole sets of problems. And I'd love to be able to tie in China but how do you protect it? And I think if there's a solution that's probably in the short term has to be technical.
Do I? I have 5 minutes. Okay. I can invite somebody to, probably just one person if you want to ask questions or have comments.
Just one question. What do you think about taxation of a platform, for instance, GAFA and Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent?
Can you repeat that?
Taxation. What do you think about taxation of a platform?
Possession.
Taxation.
taxation.
Taxation. Taxation. Global platform, for instance, GAFA and Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. Big data platform.
He's talking about taxation of the platform?
So you mean because they generate a lot of value and
okay.
wealth,
Yes.
they should be taxed for the profit. Part of the profit should belong to the public.
USA Supreme Court of Justice also allowed the taxation of global platform.
Years ago, there was a very nice system proposed and largely designed, I'll leave it at that, in the United States, which gave you the ability, when you access a piece of data, to actually divvy up income if you wanted to charge for it. Actually, that company was bought by Sony, by the way. I have no idea what Sony is doing with it. I was an advisor on the original company. And that type of protection structure could give you the ability to actually monetize legitimate access to data to cover the cost of that data, and to get revenue out of it for countries. Really tricky, though, as you know. And taxing anything is a constant attendance in courts while you argue it left and right in most countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but we did cover a fair range of things. But if you can leave anything that's to be left behind, I mean, for the panelists, there's going to be a panel discussion later on. If there are some agenda you think need to be discussed.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dave. Your great comment and presentation that gave us very fruitful information. And so the latter section, we have a discussion about how can we balance the privacy and the value in the society. So after your information, we would like to develop the new discussion.
Thank you very much. Any final word?
Just my comment that, in fact, Japan can establish a leadership if it goes about this in the right way, and maybe a transferable leadership, because the UN and those organizations tend to give average performance, if that. Example is the best way of getting people to follow you.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for participation, but please join me in thanking the two speakers.
Thank you for bringing us such a fruitful discussion. We now understand more about the opportunity and challenges we are facing at government and industry side. Again, a big applause to Professor Farber, Professor Miyata, and Professor Kokuryo.